Oh, ironies of delicious ironies. Because, for those of you who know, I am a big follower of Conservative Home. Because, as I've said before, if you want to sort of know your enemies, well, then you should sort of read their blogs, read their newspaper articles, and you'll get an idea of how they think. But it is funny today to see what we are going to read today of Conservative Home complaining in depth about the curse of Johnson, that Boris Johnson is the ultimate curse on the Conservative Party, and that he will go on to cause infinite amounts of trouble. And they talk about in this article that we're going to go through three of the potential scenarios that could happen with Johnson. Even beyond that, that all Johnson thinks about, all Johnson wants again, is another run at number 10. We know Johnson thinks he was hard done by, that if only COVID hadn't got in the way, he would have been a better prime minister. He would have had a better go at the job. So he is planning some sort of Churchillian comeback. The only thing is, at least Churchill wasn't the prime minister, failed spectacularly, and then says, actually, no, I'd like a comeback, please. No, this is far, far from Churchillian. If anything, it is completely and absolutely farcical to think that Johnson might want to come back. But even as this article rightly points out, there are sections in the Conservative media and in the non-parliamentary party that want Johnson to return. And yet the MPs, the Conservative MPs, do not want that at all. They know what an absolute disaster that would be if Johnson were to return. So today, we are going to have a look at Conservative Home complaining about the curse of Johnson when at one point they were his biggest supporters. Now, give them credit where credit is due. At least some of them appear to have sort of flipped, of course, on Johnson. But you've got to remember, Conservative Home was at one point a massive, massive Boris fanboy site at one time. So this is going to be funny. This is going to be funny. So, but pardon me. But before we go diving into this, as always, please do remember to click on the like and share button. And if you're new to the channel, click the subscribe button. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page, the one-off donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can buy me coffee. There is the YouTube thank you button, and of course, the Pony Club down below as well. So, over we go today to have a look at Conservative Home. Hang on, there we go. That's better. So, as we said, this comes from Conservative Home with the title of The Curse of Johnson. Boris Johnson rages at the Cabinet Office 3 times over it referring him to the police, its conduct in relation to the COVID inquiry, and its new cooperation with the Standards Committee. He is angry because he is frightened. And I'll tell you now, that is probably a very accurate description of Boris. And what's the old saying? Be careful of a frightened, cornered beast, which Johnson absolutely is at this moment in time. And bear in mind, a lot of people, even in the Conservative Party, think that if Johnson gets barred, if he loses that potential, if he gets sanctioned, he gets the recall committee, and he loses that by-election, that's it. He's not going to be a problem. Oh no. Boris Johnson will just be as much a problem for the Conservatives outside of the Conservative Party as if he was within it. As we've said before, I think Johnson would take back up things like writing for the Telegraph. Ultimately, I'd even think he'd start his own podcast. And there would be enough big Conservative donors that would very much gladly back that and have Johnson essentially just hurling thunderbolts at whatever or whoever is leading the Conservative Party. They would very much gladly do that. And Johnson would have a lot of pull and sway in the non-parliamentary Conservative Party. A lot. So The idea that he is gone from the party, gets barred from standing again, he's still just as dangerous. But anyway, back to it. So, not over the police referral, after all. The only risk he runs over claimed the further breaches of the COVID restrictions is of further fines. These would be embarrassing for him, but they scarcely threaten his place in the Commons. Not over the COVID inquiry either, the report which will be doubtlessly be bad for him, as it will be another former Prime Minister in his government, perhaps including the current present Prime Minister, but won't spend him from Parliament because it isn't empowered to. Anyway, while its evidence sessions start soon, the report won't be published for several years, perhaps many. And for Johnson, tomorrow is always another day. And this is something that the I noticed the Conservatives. This is something I want to point out. A lot of Conservatives know just how bad the COVID inquiry is going to be, but it's not going to be published for ages yet. That's fine. Meanwhile, you're going to have evidence sessions and a ton of stuff coming out from this inquiry that is not going to make the Conservative Party look good. But they're trying to soothe themselves by saying, "Oh, don't worry about it. That report is like 7 years away from it being published." Oh no, it's going to be beautiful when they start hearing the sessions, all the stuff that's going to come out from this inquiry, and then you'd have the final report, which is not going to be kind to you. But they're trying to soothe themselves by saying, "Oh, it's just 7 years away." But anyway, back to it. No, what alarms him is the passing of his diary entries from his period in office, in which further breaches of the COVID rules may be determined, and to the committee expressly with approval of ministers. It is investigating whether he misled the Commons over the legality of his activities in 10 Downing Street and the Cabinet Office under the COVID regulations. If it did conclude that he did, and the House then votes to suspend him for 10 days or more, he is open to a recall petition. If it gathers the required number of constituents, which is just 10%, a by-election is automatically triggered. And the assumption in the Westminster Village to date has been he would lose it. In which event, Johnson would have been censored by the Commons and rejected by his constituents, and calls would follow for him to be then barred from the Conservative Party's parliamentary candidate list. As we said, that is the worst case scenario. But even out after the Conservative Party, if all that comes to pass, Johnson would be some sort of Greek, become some sort of Greek classical god sitting on top of Mount Olympus in his podcast studio or in the Telegraph, just hurling thunderbolts at the Conservatives non-stop. And remember, Johnson still has a lot of pull in the Conservative Party. It might not seem like it, but he really still does, especially the non-parliamentary Conservative Party. And he would still cause a lot of damage. Maybe not as much as he would be as an MP, but he could still do a lot of damage. So there would be pushback in parts of the media, and our survey does suggest that most of them do believe the inquiry is unfair and that Johnson's candidacy should stand. Of course, that's the whole guff that Johnson and his supporters have been feeding out, that the whole COVID inquiry, these not the COVID inquiry, the allegations of misconduct in Downing Street, these breach of the rules, really that's just a complete non-story. This is just a non-story. This has been brought up by people who just want to get rid of Boris Johnson. It's been brought up by the Blob. It's been brought up by disgruntled Conservative MPs. It's a non-story, guys. That's what they're trying to sell people. So, nevertheless, his support amongst the parliamentary party isn't what it was. Only 21 Conservative MPs came to him in the lobbies to vote against the Windsor Framework. Support for him on the record over his blow-up with the Cabinet Office has been visible by its absence. The long and short of it is that if Rishi Sunak were to want to bar Johnson from the list in these circumstances, he would be. And even then, I don't think he would. Rishi Sunak is such a weak prime minister. He has had opportunities to get rid of people like Suella Braverman, Kimmy Badenoch, and other people from his cabinet office. who have been absolute failures, yet he has not done so. Kimmy Badenoch has had 100 days of failure in her post, showing that she is not fit, not only to be, as people once said, that she would be a future leader of the Conservative Party, but she's not even fit to be a cabinet minister. And then Suella Braverman comes out as bold as brass and just says, yeah, I'm going to be the next prime minister. I am going to do a better job than Rishi. And not one word, not one peep from him. Rishi Sunak is a completely weak prime minister. So the idea that he would even do that, I very much doubt it. So no other seat, of course, would be allowed to adopt him as a Tory candidate. And even in the event of the Conservatives losing a general election, why should a new Tory leader want him back? After all, destabilizing the party leadership is a Johnson speciality, which is, again, completely true. Why would any future Conservative leader want Johnson back? Unless, of course, you are pro-Johnson, and then you realize sort of Johnson's capabilities, that he's a good sort of cheerleader. He's good for sort of, rallying the troops. But other than that, that's all Johnson's really good for. No wonder it's claimed that rather than face a by-election, he would stand down from the Commons. That would enable him to dodge any future suspension from the list, but he could at least also duck a humiliating election defeat. However, today he finds the dark clouds gathering around his head, piercing by a very tantalizing shaft of light. For on this site, Lord Ashcroft reports in his new poll in Johnson's constituency that he would find he could win any by-election, scooping up half the votes. He adds that while the skeptics will make several points about this result, all of them valid, there is a good reason to accept the picture at face value. Again, I do not believe he would win a by-election. I really do not believe he would win a by-election. I think if you could find a perfect, really good candidate to put up against Johnson, and you sort of align all of this, you have sort of a progressive alliance, you look at tactical voting, I think you would get rid of Johnson very, very easily. No doubt in my mind. And like I say, all of these, all valid points all about that result. I don't think it's as clear cut as Lord Ashcroft says that he would win a by-election. But then again, we might be wrong. Maybe Lord Ashcroft is right. Maybe he does do that. Maybe he does win in the by-election. That is, again, possibility we should think about. So, suppose for a moment that the committee intends to suspend Johnson for more than 10 days, and a recall petition is successful, but then Johnson then stands and wins the subsequent by-election. That would change everything, at least politically. The good people of Uxbridge and South Ruislip would have thereby put up two fingers to Harriet Harman, the committee's chair, and any Conservative member who had supported the suspension, and indeed the entire House of Commons, or rather the necessary majority who would vote to back the committee's finding. The people would have spoken. No removal from the Tory parliamentary candidates list could then credibly follow. Johnson would presumably then win the seat once again at a next general election. No exile for him. No casting out from the Garden of Eden. Boris is back. And that, to be honest, is what at least many people would hope for. At least, certainly, shall we say, the Boris Johnson, of course, what hopes for, that he can, if maybe he can win that by-election. And we'll see, if it comes to it, what would happen. Like I say, sometimes in a by-election, especially like that, you don't really know what's going to happen. And bear in mind, Sunak, as much as he might not want to, would have to be dragged in by Boris Johnson. They would have to do all the photo ops and all that, and that would be so embarrassing for Rishi Sunak having to sort of back Johnson. And that playing out in the next general election, where you could replay all the old Tory incompetency, the corruption, all the stuff that has happened over the past 13 years, and then you just show a picture of, a smiling Boris Johnson with, with PM Rishi Sunak welcoming him back into the party. Yeah, it's not going to look good. So now think on. Sunak will either win that election, in which case Johnson will rock his boat, or else he will have lost it, in which case he will capsize it, or try to. And the flyers of the letters of leadership ambitions are still far from spent. That is why he is still an MP. After all, in the latest scenario, that blonde beast burns hope of a hopeful Churchillian return. I can't quite see, though, Conservative MPs, after all the events of the past few years, putting his name on the list to members, at least in the immediate aftermath pardon me, of an electoral defeat. However, none of the potential candidates to replace Sunak as Tory leader are especially convincing. And of course, that threatens the worst of all worlds. And oh boy, any future Tory leadership contest is going to be absolutely glorious. They're going to be tearing at each other to shreds. And if you thought last summer the leadership contest was bad and there was a lot of mudslinging going on there, oh boy, it's going to be even worse. So, continues. A few weeks ago, I had Johnson in his study, contemplating the future. In it, Keir Starmer is Prime Minister. Voters didn't like Labour much, but they are prepared after 13 years of Conservatives to give him a chance. A new Tory leader is becalmed, and in those circumstances, a push to bring back Johnson becomes more plausible, or at least to him, and to a demoralised, discontented Conservative MPs, and to bits of the Tory media, and to party activists in search of a comfort blanket, especially perhaps if Donald Trump's is America's president once again. Taking a leaf out of the Republican playbook, Team Johnson will say, bring back a proven winner. Disraeli was said to be Lord Denby's necessity and his curse. Parts of the Conservative world continue to insist that Britain's Trump is the party's necessity. But would it be haunted if, by the circumstances, by the curse of Johnson? Is the public really willing to forget the parties? Or, more to the point, the tax rises and record immigration? Even if party members are prepared to do so, in many ways, the verdict is a harsh one. Johnson's premiership was plagued by the pandemic and war. And again, that's an excuse that, it was plagued by the pandemic, plagued by war. Well, there are many ways that, this war has affected other countries as well, but why are we handling it worse? What about the pandemic? Other countries had to suffer the pandemic as well, but we handled it worse. The idea that you could just bat those away by saying, it was the pandemic, it was the war. No. Johnson failed at every single opportunity. He was an absolutely awful prime minister, and that's what people need to start saying. I also notice you don't mention Brexit in there, because Johnson's Brexit deal is awful. His Australian and New Zealand trade deal, awful. Going to have big, bad economic ramifications for years to come. So, he helped to shape the Western support for Ukraine. Again, not true. From what we know initially, he did not support it. It was Ben Wallace who basically marched into his office and said, look, Johnson, you need to go and you need to support Ukraine. If you don't, I'm leaving. I'm going to make it publicly known. So that's what made Boris go and support Ukraine, because of the push he got from Ben Wallace. Other than that, again, as much as I do support our support for Ukraine, Boris Johnson does not really should have all the credit for that, but that's another story. And of course, delivered a vaccine triumph. Congratulations, you got the vaccines, but it was hardly a triumph considering what was preceding that. He had, of course, noble ambitions for housing, which Tory backbenchers snuffed out. But it can't be truthfully be claimed that his time of office was marked by a strategic purpose, or that his intent to spend more now and tax if necessary didn't run into trouble. Like I say, even if you take out the pandemic, if you take out the war, the whole idea that in reality, Johnson would have had this amazing premiership. It would have been absolutely amazing, and he would have taken on the Conservative Party to a historic fifth time in a row election win. No, there is no indicator that if you take the pandemic, if you take the war out of the equation, if those things had never happened, this idea that Johnson would have been absolutely fine, he would have been an amazing prime minister. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. True, he might have maybe survived a bit longer, but be seen as a good prime minister? Absolutely not. So, the worst possible outcome for the Conservative Party is that it becomes a supporting actor in the Johnson tragicomedy, and that the play goes on, stretching before and after, like the time in Eliot's poem. David Cameron, Theresa May, Rishi Sunak have all been upstaged by Johnson. Who's next? That's a very valid question, and it is because people like Cameron, May, Sunak all did not deal with Johnson when they could have. There were many opportunities where they could have dismissed him, sent him packing, and yet they did not once. And the idea that Rishi Sunak is going to sort of discipline Johnson, absolutely not. So some will say that the bullet is better bitten now, and that the Commons would be better off without him. I can't get there. On one hand, I feel somehow that Johnson may be needed. Again, this is what I said about this being a complete and absolutely, at one point, was a massive Boris Johnson fan site. That's what Conservative Home was. And now you write an article called The Curse of Johnson, and that you're like pointing out all the truths. That Johnson is a massive trouble, that he wasn't a good prime minister, but he might have been if not for the war, if not for the pandemic. You can't really do that. You've got to deal with the reality of what happened. Johnson had the pandemic and he had the war. Now, admittedly, you can say, yeah, he's dealt with the war good, but obviously the economic consequences have been not very well handled with because of Brexit, because of the supply chain issues that have been caused by Brexit. Again, something you are not bringing up. I noticed that very much so. But again, Johnson was in charge during the pandemic, and he made every wrong decision time and time and time again. So, on one hand, I do feel that Johnson may be needed. If the war in the Eastern Europe worsens further, and that is his suspension from the House would be unjustified, an act of politics, not justice. So wait a second. I feel somehow that Johnson may be needed if the war in Eastern Europe worsens further, and that his suspension from the House would be unjustified. An act of politics, not justice. No, you do not need Boris Johnson to continue the support for Ukraine. To be honest, Ben Wallace, as much as I don't like him for being sort of, a conservative, gotta give him credit for this massive support he has shown Ukraine. He has done more for the support of Ukraine. It would not be unjustified to suspend him if the war gets worse and you would suspend him. Oh, it's just an act of politics, and completely not. I'm sorry. No, that is a ridiculous matter to get rid of. It's just like you may remember a couple of years ago, we were looking at potentially having a general election. Oh, we can't have one now because there's a war on. What? Oh, dear. Any excuse not to get rid of him. And of course, now obviously came the bit of fence sitting. So, I thought he gave a good account of himself before the committee. I don't know what committee you were watching, but he absolutely did not do well in that committee. No one in their right mind would say Boris Johnson did well before that committee. and that the vote set up an inquiry was driven by malice, party maneuvers, and a thirst for revenge. So you are saying we should not have the COVID inquiry, that we should not have a massive public inquiry into one of the worst pandemic responses in the world, and why just a couple of years ago, when under a Labour health secretary, he had been told to the House that the WTO says that we and France were the best prepared countries. The idea that we shouldn't have an inquiry because, oh, it's just malice, it's just, it's a thirst for revenge. So, furthermore, the yoking together of a suspension and recall is unplanned and unfair. Oh, God. As Conservative members of the committee recognised. Oh. On the other, the scenario I set out may be unlikely, but it is entirely plausible. And the Tory psychology it describes is real. The party is carrying a burden. Sometimes it makes light of it or pretends it isn't there. At other stages, it sags under its weight. It twists, it turns, it shrugs, it writhes, but it can't get the monkey off its back. Well, here's the thing. If you can't get the monkey off your back, shoot it. Take it out. That's what should have happened to Boris Johnson years ago. Years ago. He was completely underprepared for being a Conservative MP. He should have never have been one. All the warning signs were there. This is where I bring out Johnson at number 10. All the warning signs were there that he was going to be a bad MP, that he was going to be a bad Prime Minister. And no one listened to them because, oh, it's Boris, he'll be fine. This is why I said at the beginning, Conservative Home, massive at one point, Boris fan site, essentially. It was only Boris's, probably, what it should have been. Its real name should have been at one point. But the idea that you write an article pointing out all the misgivings of Johnson, indicating correctly the problems that Johnson causes for the party and its leaders time and time again, and then go, well, I don't really think we should get rid of him. That to me is wild. I cannot believe you would write such an article pointing out all the problems that Boris has caused, saying about how much of a problem child he is, how much turmoil he's caused within your own party, and then go, I don't know if we want to get rid of him. That to me is absolutely wild. But as always, thank you very much for watching. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.